So our next presentation is a tag team affair with Charles Eckel and Giles Heron presenting getting started with OpenDaylight. So there's going to be a practical demo aspect as well as...
We're just going to move next.
Probably more in the next phase.
Okay.
Yeah, we've actually got two presentations, like one running onto the other, so more in the second half.
Oh, okay, so you're going to do this as a 1 hour presentation, or are you going to do it as a...
No, we'll be flexible. We'll break.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the next one is doing GBP with... no, not GBP. BGP.
BGP. Yeah.
GBP with OpenDaylight. So.
Yeah, so I kind of cover the basics, the easy stuff with OpenDaylight, and then Giles will take you in more in-depth use case with using BGP. My name's Charles Eckel. Title here is Open Source Developer Evangelist. So I work at Cisco, but the cool thing about my job is I get to work with a lot of the stuff that Cisco does with open source, where we're contributing to open source, where we're using it in our products. And OpenDaylight is just an example of that. So this is a pretty introductory talk into OpenDaylight. And feel free to jump in with questions at any time, let me know, and I'll certainly try to leave room for questions at the end. Quick rundown of the agenda. So just to level set, I'll go very quickly and briefly into what SDN is. Then what is OpenDaylight? Then we'll look at how easy it is to install and get started with OpenDaylight. Then run through a few use cases, and I'll take the easiest use case of the ones I show you to demonstrate to you, partly because it's also something you can pretty trivially then do on your own, set up on your own laptop, which hopefully you'll want to do and find interesting after this talk. So first of all, what is SDN? So I think when SDN first came out, the whole idea was that's this separation of the control plane and the data plane. And so, fair enough. Based on using OpenFlow, that was like the protocol that was used. It still is used, but especially initially, that's what everyone was thinking of. And then this logically centralized control plane. Just instead of having all the control spread across all kinds of network elements, you kind of bring it into one place where you coalesce all it. And then we think of white label switches too. It's like we can get rid of a lot of that expensive hardware and just run everything using these white label switches. And it's not that that's not a valid case, it is, and it certainly is still happening, but I think SDN has come to mean a lot more, and there's a lot more value to SDN than just that. So you can certainly, and I think should, think of SDN more broadly. And one of the most valuable things there is, I think, if you look at SDN as really unleashing or providing you access to the vast amount of information that's in the network. It's always been there, but it's never really been something that's been exposed to you as an application developer. With SDN, that's something that is very valuable, and I think that's really where the power of SDN lies. It's in the network programmability opportunities that SDN exposes for you. So this is just illustrating that broader definition that I just mentioned of SDN. You see, of course, there still is the separation of the control plane and the data plane or the forwarding plane. But what I'm really trying to illustrate here is that there's a lot of information that's down deep into the network, which now when you're writing an application, can have access to. So the idea is that you can be seeing what's going on with the network. You can take that into account. Your application can do something intelligent based on that, kind of program that into the network through the controller, and you just have this nice cycle where you can start to write some really clever, useful, network-aware applications. So if you think of that broader definition of an SDN controller, what is it that we really expect or need from an SDN controller? Of course, it needs to work and make our network, function, but, more importantly, I think we really want it to be a platform on which you can write these network-aware applications that I was just talking about. You want it to be something that provides you with a good development environment for writing those applications. And it's going to be very important to you in order to give you that development environment, that there's APIs that are available to you and that are well-defined. You're going to need to be able to have some abstractions because you're not going to want to worry about what the underlying network topology is. You want it to be able to abstract that away from you. And you also don't want to be worrying about protocol independence. We mentioned that you could use OpenFlow, but there's a lot of other protocols you could be using. And you don't really, at the application level, you don't want to care or know or worry about those details. And notice that, in that, maybe I did use the word OpenFlow, but it's not limited to OpenFlow. This really goes, far beyond that. So now let's jump and take a look at OpenDaylight. So a bit of an eye chart here, but the idea that I wanted to get across to you is in that middle part, don't worry about all the different names that are really in there, but you basically have your basic networking functions, in the red that's kind of in the middle. You have some enhanced networking functions. There's a lot of functionality that's built into OpenDaylight. And those are the core things that it kind of needs to be a network, a controller. And it does all those jobs very well. But I think more importantly is when we start to think about from an application perspective how it's going to work. And if you go, well, let me go down first. OpenFlow is the thing that's mentioned on the far left-hand side, but it has plugins for all kinds of other network protocols that you might want to support in your network. So you're not just limited to OpenFlow. There's much more that it can deal with. And then as a application developer, it also exposes, if you look at the top, the APIs. You get RESTful APIs, including RESTconf, and you also get netconf. So you get these APIs that you can build your applications on top of. And then OpenDaylight is going to take care of abstracting away the rest, the different topologies, the different protocols that are underneath. So maybe just to back up and give you a brief history of OpenDaylight. So it was founded back in 2013, launched as a project within the Linux Foundation, and basically started when a group of founding companies came together and contributed a bunch of software and, more importantly, maybe development resources to kick it off and get it going. And it grew very quickly. I say 600 plus contributors. I know there were over 600. It obviously is a number that continues to grow, as does the lines of code. And most of it is written in Java. So when you think of OpenDaylight, you can think of it as being a Java project. The first release came out in February of 2014. It was called Hydrogen. And since then, they've been having releases roughly every 8 months, where you saw that eye chart I had at the beginning. There's all kinds of projects and functionality and pieces in there, a lot of plugins at the bottom. So a lot of people are contributing to OpenDaylight in different areas. But it has a very modular design, which allows that. But the idea is, hey, every once in a while, we want to pull all this together into a stable release. And so that's something that it's built into the planning, that every 8 months, essentially, come out with a new release. And it's pretty much been able to stick with that. The current stable release is called Boron, and the next release, which will be coming out in May, is called Carbon. And in case you haven't, guessed, the release names are all named after elements in the periodic table. So you also get to, when you play with OpenDaylight, to learn a bit about that as well. Very briefly, just go over from a software architecture point of view. I already mentioned it's Java. That was just chosen as the language that was going to be used for it. Uses the Maven build system, which if you work at all with Java, you'd be very familiar with. And then also uses Carafe. And Carafe is important because when you install OpenDaylight, remember there's that tons of functionality in there. Almost no one really wants to use every bit of functionality that it has. In fact, you usually use a small subset in your network. And if you turned everything on, I wouldn't want to guarantee for you that it's actually going to work. So when you install OpenDaylight, it comes up with a very bare number of features installed, just the core that it needs to start up. And then you can enable individual features, the ones that you specifically need for your use cases in your network. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. So with that bit of background, now let's go look at the installation. And don't worry if you can't read the details here. I'm just giving you the link where you can go and download the code. You're always going to find at this place the stable releases, like the latest stable version for each of the most recent releases. So you can go there and just grab that, download it, and then it's as simple as unzipping it and just typing this command, this bin caraf. And with that, it's going to load up, and no complicated configuration, nothing like that you need to do, because as I mentioned at the beginning, it's going to start with very few features, and then once it's up and running, you will be able to turn on individual features that you want. So playing around with the features in caraf, just a few handy commands here. You can do feature : list. That'll show you all the features that are available on the platform. Feature list -I will tell you which ones are already installed, and then you can go and you can install one feature if you want. You can install multiple features, and you can also uninstall features, which is handy. But the caveat here, the tricky thing that I want to warn you of, is when you do uninstall a feature, from the CLI perspective, it'll look like it was uninstalled, but it's actually going to continue to exist and live on within the controller unless you stop the controller and then restart it again using this bin caraf and a clean install. So just a word of warning there, because that could trip you up. So what does this look like? This screenshot that I have here, this is just after I installed OpenDaylight initially. And I did a list of the features that are there. And this little X means the features installed in the installed list. And you can see there's very, very little there. This is just the core platform. And then there's something in OpenDaylight that I'll show you shortly called Deluxe. Deluxe is just the kind of graphical, the user interface, the front end that gets put on. You have the CLI, but Deluxe is a very useful interface that you can use as well. So in the example here, I'm just showing you, well, if I wanted to figure out how to turn on the Deluxe feature, install it, how would I go about doing that? And so I use that feature list command and just grep for Deluxe, and it'll show me all the things that contain Deluxe. And in this example, what I did was I installed the Deluxe core, which gives me the minimum set. I could have also done Deluxe all, would have just installed a few more things. And then I show you that after running that command, now if I do a feature list, again, I can see that I got all the core parts of Deluxe installed. Once I have that, then I can just go to navigate to open up Deluxe. And in this example, I put localhost because I'm running it locally on my laptop. So that would just be whatever the IP address of your controller is. And on port 8181, you log in, and this is an example of what it looks like. And we'll go into that in a little more detail later too. So now some example use cases. And the first one, which this is one I'll go into in a bit more detail with a demo, is to show you how you can load up OpenDaylight and then use something called Mininet. How many people have heard of Mininet? Okay, great. So you probably won't have too much difficulty with this then. The idea is that to use a VM that has Mininet inside of it and just use that to create a sample network, which you can then have OpenDaylight play with. And then just to get it in your head, but I'm not going to go into details on either of these, but you'll actually hear talks later on today that talk a bit more and a bit, about both. Another example use case, which is very interesting, you've probably heard about VPP, and this just shows pictorially how you could use OpenDaylight and with VPP as the underlying network underneath it. Maybe next year we'll show that one. and then here's a BGP-LS, because again, there's the reason I wanted to show these different ones is the Mininet one is using OpenFlow, and whereas here now you can see that another use case where we're not using OpenFlow, we're using BGP and PSEP instead. Okay, so now we're going to go through how to set this up for yourself and what the demo is going to do. So I mentioned using Mininet within a VM, so I just downloaded that and followed these instructions. Thanks to Brian Linkletter, he provided fantastic instructions for how to do this. So I put that link there because I didn't want to try to describe it again myself. He did a wonderful job. And so then in one terminal, I'll start up OpenDaylight, which I installed just as I showed you by downloading it, and we covered that in the previous slide. And then in the other one, I'm going to spin up Mininet, and I'm going to log into it and tell it to create a network that has 3 switches and a host attached to each switch. And I'm just going to tell it to talk to my controller, my OpenDaylight controller, and this happens to be the IP address which the FOSDEM network's given me. So you just replace that with whatever your IP address is. And this other IP address, the 192.168 IP address, that's what got assigned by Mininet to my the VM. Oh, and then I'll go into the browser and we'll take a look and play around with that a bit. So that's just a screenshot of what Mininet's going to do when it starts up. I won't spend any more time on these. We'll go ahead and give the demo a try, and if it doesn't work, then I'll fall back to using this. So, okay, so let's see. So here is my OpenDaylight controller. And if I just do that bin carafe command that we mentioned before, you can see it starting up. And while that's starting up, why don't I go ahead and take a look at here's where I have at the bottom here, my Mininet VM that I installed. And I'll get that going as well. Okay, so OpenDaylight started. I have my prompt here. I can do like one of the commands that we talked about, feature list -I, and I can see all the features I have installed. Quite a few, because I already ran that command that I showed you before that was going to install the minimum feature set that I needed for VirtualBox. It's in the slides, so you can find that yourself. But you'll see, because of that, I have Deluxe installed, I have the L2 switch that I need, I have RESTconf. All of those are going to be used for the rest of this demo. So those are all installed, and I should now be able to go and log in. Okay, so I'm logged into OpenDaylight, and I'm looking at my network, and I have no network. So that's because I haven't done anything with Mininet yet. So it started, I need to log into it. The credentials are Mininet. They're pretty easy to remember, and it's also in the slides. And now I'm just going to run those commands to start up a little sample network, and I just put it in a script called start Mininet network. It's just one command though. I just didn't want to have a bunch of typos when I'm here. So, okay, so that started up. Now if I go back to my OpenDaylight and check it out and reload, so now I can see my 3 switches. Those just came up within Mininet. But I don't see my hosts yet, but if I generate some traffic, do a ping all, they're all connected, so they work. And if I do a reload, now I can see them as well. So just a simple example of how this network now gets discovered and attached into my OpenDaylight network. Now I can look at my different nodes, and I can see, make this a little bit bigger maybe. I can see all the connections that I have and just some statistics. Not a whole lot's gone on because I just created this network. But I think what might be more interesting is I wanted to show you, because the point I wanted to get across was, application development and how this is good for network-aware applications. And this is pretty cool. This shows you all of the models, because maybe I didn't mention this before, but OpenDaylight it's really a model-driven architecture where you put the functionality that you're putting into it, you define in a Yang model. And then it reads that Yang model in, and it's able to generate APIs and based off of that. So these are all the APIs that are available to me within the platform. And there's quite a few. Now, maybe all of them won't actually have anything on the back end yet. It depends what I've loaded into the network. But just to give you an example, one that I know has something in it is if I go to the OpenDaylight inventory. And this is just where I can go and look and see what's in my network. So if I look at the operational data, there's basically, you'll see this convention most of the time. There's an operational data store and a configuration data store. The configuration is what was there when I loaded up, when I started up my controller. And I can go and I can do a command. If I click on this, see it's showing me at the bottom what the command is, the rest command. So I can do a get of all the nodes that are in my configuration. And you see I get an error here because there was no configuration. But remember, that's what we saw. When we started it up, there was no configuration, no configured nodes. They got discovered at runtime. So if instead I look at my operational and go on the nodes and do this same command, fingers crossed, this should actually work. And it looks like it did. And if I go down, you can see what got returned. And Deluxe just gives me a nice way to scan through this. This is exactly what we saw in the picture before, right? I have 3 different nodes, OpenFlow 1, 2, and 3, and I can see information about each of them, the packets and that they have and whatnot. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because all of this is what's available to you now programmatically through just basic REST calls. And this is a very simple example, but hopefully it impresses on you that now as an application developer, I have very easy access to this information, which before I may not have been able to get. Okay, let me get out of this. And I'm just going to jump back to my slides. Okay, and now I just want to leave you with some additional resources. As I mentioned, I work with open source at Cisco, so everything that I'm working on within Cisco can be found in this open source dev center. This is where the projects that we work on, like OpenDaylight, OpenStack, you can find information about them and what Cisco's doing and where we're using it in our products. And there's a whole site there where you can get more information. This I wanted to show because these are a bunch of applications that we've written. They're all open source, they're all free. They're really just there to kind of help plant that seed that, hey, this is a great platform for writing applications. OpenDaylight is, and it's quite straightforward to do it. Not only are these useful, but they serve really as great kind of training tools, I would say. So you can download those, all available. This other thing which is quite handy is for Mininet, it was quite straightforward for me to get a VM and just spin it up on my own laptop. But you can imagine that maybe you want to do something more complicated where you have like some real network equipment behind it. And so we have these sandboxes which you can also use for free. Log into them and experiment with some more complicated network examples. And Giles will show you kind of an example of that later on. And then this is just a place you can go for help in case you're having problems with or have questions or want to share something. And that's basically it. So hopefully I left a few minutes for questions. And if anyone has any questions, yeah.
My question is how much of OpenDaylight is implemented in the Cisco product?
I don't, do you know? I don't think that much.
But I don't think it's,
Yeah, the question was how much of OpenDaylight's implemented in Cisco ACI, and I think they're As far as I know, they're quite separate. Yeah, totally different.
And they're probably different market spaces anyways, because ACI is quite targeted around one particular platform, Nexus switches, whereas ODL, I guess the way I was characterizing it, it's what Charles was saying, I guess, about outbound. You know, when you kind of compare it to ACI, you compare it to Contra guys here, or you compare it to ARMS, the problem is kind of hard to compare. So you're comparing a Swiss Army knife to an individual tool.
Yeah.
ODL does just about anything you want in networking space. And the downside of that is, you know, my Swiss Army knife is not the best saw that I own. I have better saws out there. There's always that tension between having a very general platform and having like a more specific tool. And I guess the demos I'm going to show later, really to me where the value is in OpenDaylight is always once you start using more than one outbound plugin. So you tend to use one plugin to learn something about the network and then one plugin to do something to the network. So and both the demos I was going to show are in that kind of space.
Yeah.
So OpenDaylight is ready for telco and NFV traffic.
Yeah. Is OpenDaylight ready for telco NFV traffic? And I would say yes. I mean, there's some big providers using it. I mean, AT&T is using it. It's part of their e-comp platform. Tencent has been very kind of open in sharing how they're using. And if you've never looked into Tencent and their network, it's just amazing the scale that they're working with. You can see why they'd want to have something like OpenDaylight, but they've really brought back a lot of learnings too, and maybe driven some of the performance or stability stuff back into OpenDaylight.
Can I just add on to that? So the XDN at the ISG ran a plug test over the last 2 weeks, and we took an OpenDaylight platform running OpenDaylight, running OpenDaylight SFC running through that, and it passed all the tests and went very well. So it's fully capable in an interview environment.
Oh, okay. Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.